Hi guys, I'm Comrade Darkslayer, and today I'm going to show you this little video documentary I made about Marxism, progressives, why America went downhill, the truth about the CIA and what it can do, and the fascist state of America. The CIA and, well, basically like why the CIA is just an evil agency that tries to overthrow governments, of course, but it's also fascist, and let's be honest, but the CIA and FBI are domestic terrorists. Let me repeat that. The CIA and FBI are domestic terrorists. And in this video, I'm also going to show you and talk about why America is always fascist, and that America can never redeem itself from how fascist and Nazi-like it has become. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope you get something out of it. This is for educational purposes, but also something a fascinating watch. This is for educational purposes, but also it's going to be a fascinating watch. I hope you learn something from it, and I hope the truth will blow your mind. Okay, so enjoy, and I'm Comrade Darkslayer, over and out. So now, by the way, before I introduce this clip, this is, just to give context, this is Richard Wolff explaining what Marxism really is, and what does it really mean. And this is him explaining who Karl Marx really is, and what Karl Marx was like growing up, and he explains his origins. Just give context to that, so enjoy and take it for what you will.
Brief history as a way to get into this. Marxism is built around old Karl here. Born in 1818, died in 1883, a man of the 19th century. Born, by the way, very near where my father was born, on the French-German border. The town has two names, Trier in German and Trèves in French, because it's bilingual in the same way. Was a child of middle-class people, was given a college education, which right away puts him in the top 2 or 3%. At that time, nobody had such educations, where he studied philosophy and intended to become a professor of philosophy, which indeed was his first job. But, like me, he noticed struggles in the street, working people struggling with the local government. And he was interested, which you weren't supposed to be. And he went and talked to them, which you weren't supposed to do. And he began writing articles about their situation, which he was absolutely not to do. And the university did what they normally do. They fired him. That's his intellectual interest in that topic got him fired. This didn't bother him at all. He didn't like what he was seeing in the university anyway. So he became active with these people that he had studied and became an activist, which brought him immediately to the attention of the local police and the local authorities in Germany at that time. And so they did what the Germans and many Europeans at that time did to shut down political dissent. They didn't kill you, and they didn't imprison you. The preferred program was exile. You were sent out. And remember, Europe is a place of lots of countries in a small distance. So sending you out is putting you on a train, and an hour later, you're out. Okay, so the Germans put him on a train to Paris, and literally 2 hours later, he's in Paris, out. But they informed the Paris police that he was coming. And they met him at the train station, and they basically said to him, "You're not staying here." And they put him on a train, they exiled him to Brussels, another hour and a half, to north instead of west. And the same thing happened, the Belgian police didn't want it. You're going to London. And he ended in London, and London didn't make you leave. Those years, London was the place refugees from all over settled, and he spent the rest of his life in London, which meant most of his adult work, certainly Das Kapital, and were all done as a citizen in London. His knowledge of English and his knowledge of conditions in the English-speaking part of the world was excellent, because that's where he lived most of his productive life. He even made his living for several years being a reporter, European reporter for a New York City newspaper, the New York World, during the time of the American Civil War, where he wrote many, many essays on slavery and the Civil War for the European audience, because he was a reporter for this New York newspaper. He was always a theorist and a critic and an activist. In fact, he didn't recognize that these are different words. That's an American thing. For him, he was an activist because he engaged thought. He debated different questions. He engaged in the issues of his day, like slavery and the Civil War, but many other issues too. He wrote for public consumption. He gave speeches to unions, to civic organizations. He was always active and always thinking and writing, because for him that was part of what being active was. He would not have recognized the distinction academic activist. It would have meant nothing to him. He was whatever those things combined are.
Later in the same video, this is another clip of Professor Richard Wolff explaining Karl Marx's critique of capitalism. He goes in depth of how Marx views capitalism and how Marx perfectly annihilates all the problems and issues with capitalism. He even demolishes all capitalist arguments I can think of, and he basically debunks a lot of the pro-capitalist arguments out there, and it's really engaging, it's really fascinating, but basically he just kind of goes to depth and explains how Marx exposes capitalism. So watch it for yourself. So I hope you enjoy and get something out of it. And here's a good example of this.
All his life, he devoted himself to criticizing capitalism. It's really important. That's what he did, and he was super at it. He did not believe in describing or imagining or constructing an image of socialism or communism. He never did that. He didn't write a book about it. He didn't devote it. He mocked that. He said, I'm not a crystal ball gazer. I'm not going to tell you what the future is. Nobody knows what the future is. That's not my job. My job is to tell you what it is that's going on in capitalism in order to figure out how this system, like every other system, is going through its history. Every economic system, he argued, is born, evolves over time, and dies to be replaced by another. We have slavery, it comes, it evolves, it dies. We have feudalism, it comes, it evolves, it dies. We have primitive tribalism, it comes, capitalism, reasonably to assume, same history. Born, England, 18th or 17th century, evolves over time, becomes the world system. And let's see now, what's the next step? It dies. And it dies under its own, Marx, internal contradictions, the problems of itself as it functions. You don't die necessarily, most of you will not die because someone comes over and beats you over the head. Your own bodily, mental processes will bring you to an end. They'll wear out, whatever words you want, and the system, that's how Marx understood it. He wanted to identify what's the contradiction driving capitalism. Where in this process is it? Is it growing? Is it dying? What? In order to help those of us that are living in it to, in his view, help it along, to get to that next stage, because he was convinced that the human race can do better. By the way, that attitude that we can do better than the current system, that's what helped get us out of slavery, that's what helped get us out of feudalism. Reasonable to assume it'll help us get out of capitalism, unless you need to believe that in the particular period you're in, history has stopped. Well, don't laugh too quick. You live in a country which is committed to that idea, that capitalism is the greatest thing since sliced bread, probably better, and will never go away. Remember Mr. Trump, State of the Union this year? Socialism will never happen here. That's the statement made by every leader of every country just before it went socialist. Think about it. His assurance that it won't happen is worth exactly what everything else he says is worth. It's whatever occurs to him at that moment. Repeated 6 or 7 times. Marx was a critic. And how successful was he as a critic? I don't know. Let's see. He writes, he stops writing, he dies in 1883. What's it, 150 years ago, not even. In that period of time, 150 years, not very long, human history. In 150 years, his ideas have spread to every single country on the face of this earth. Every country has Marxist study groups, Marxist political parties, and or Marxist unions, and or Marxist governments, little governments like the Chinese. They call themselves Marxist. Put aside for the moment exactly what they mean, but the spread of Marxism is staggeringly successful.
Now, here's a great interview with Chris Hedges I highly recommend that I really personally liked. But here's a really good clip of Chris Hedges talking about slaves in Washington. And he even talks about Washington was a slave owner, and kind of talks about his disdain for George Washington, why George Washington is in some way a fascist, which is interesting and fascinating. But then he later talks about democracy. He does later talk about the genocide against the natives. He does talk about the problem with the system, and he even talks about why America has always been disillusioned. So this is a really interesting, and this is a good example of it. Check it out. And this is a good example of what I think.
Cool. Yeah. Are you a fan of Washington?
No.
No. Because of the slaves, or?
Well, I mean, slaves. He spent his whole career decimating Native American tribes, and not only that, but stealing their land, quite literally, sending out surveyors, and like for instance in Ohio. So he had huge tracts of land. Remember, the British had set up a demarcation line so that the British couldn't settle beyond that. That's why so many Native Americans fought on the side of the British. And Washington and a few other speculators, not only in the Indian Wars, were brutal, but they took the land, and then once after the Revolution, because Washington laid claim to so much land, he was, as Howard Zinn writes, he was the wealthiest person in the United States. Was he a great general? Yes, but I mean, so was Napoleon. I mean, I've been in lots of wars, and great generals are great killers. So I'm not a terrible fan of Washington, or frankly of most of the white aristocrats who founded the country, because, and they're quite open about it in the Federalist Papers, they have no interest in they're terrified of popular democracy. And they created all sorts of mechanisms to lock people out, to keep in aristocratic rule. And that is the brilliance of Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States.
I was going to ask you about secret societies. I didn't know if you had any insight, and I wonder if maybe because they were all Freemasons too, you don't think that they spoke about the things that Howard Zinn specifically, like we can't have actual democracy.
Oh, they did.
Okay.
We know they did. They were openly frightened of it. And that's why first of all, you had women, Native American, African American, men without property were all disenfranchised. Then you had this ridiculous electoral college, and then you had senators used to be appointed.
Right.
Now they're selected by Goldman Sachs, but they used to be appointed. Those were all mechanisms to thwart popular democracy, and they were quite open about the purpose of those mechanisms and how they feared direct democracy.
The part that kind of gets me is that I don't think anyone really quite understands that because the way we're taught history.
Now later in the same interview, this is a clip of Chris Hedges talking about George Washington, the Revolutionary War, the Founding Fathers, Thomas Paine. But later Chris Hedges does talk about Jordan Peterson. And, I do like how he does see through Jordan Peterson's bullshit, by the way. And he talks about corporations in universities. And I like how he does say that, he does talk about corporations and universities, that universities are too corporatized. But he doesn't just talk about that. He does talk about the problem with corporatism in general. And he talks about, people are being overtaxed. And he talks about basically, the disparity of wealth in this country. So I recommend it. This is a good clip. This is a good example of it, and this kind of sums what I believe in too.
I was going to ask you something about, you mentioned in the universities how they've kind of lost a certain sense or grasp of the truth in a certain way. And something that I heard Jordan Peterson say, that all the universities were, kind of taken over by left-wing intellectuals. And I just thought, I don't know if he was talking about Canada or the 60s, but if he was talking about America I don't know if you wish to.
Well, I wish they were taken over by left-wing intellectuals. It just shows you what Jordan Peterson knows. This whole kind of phantom force of left-wing intellectuals is a myth. Because if you are seriously left-wing, you're never going to get through a tenure committee. You have to remember that places like Princeton or Harvard are completely corporatized. I've taught at Princeton, I went to Harvard. And the power of those corporate entities that donate, even though these institutions have more money than they need, is such that if any faculty member actually steps up and confronts in a real way the corporate coup d'etat and neoliberalism and the savagery that corporations have inflicted, not just in the United States but globally, they won't stay. They'll be very swiftly marginalized. So no, the universities have been largely purged. I always find that argument by Jordan Peterson, I don't know where it comes from.
He might be talking about Canada.
No, I speak in Canada a lot. Well, Canada has a better university system than we do.
Well, he'd have more of an argument, I suppose.
He doesn't have any argument.
Is Germany back? Are they back, like, secretly, kind of, with the, IMF, World Bank?
Well, they're not even that secret about it. Ask Greece. They're pretty upfront about it.
Well, are they now, like, without an army, kind of back in charge?
Economically, without question.
Are certain cartels and leaders more trusted and respected than the corrupt government? Is it sort of a violent renegade opposition party in Mexico? And is the solution as simple as prohibition, where if you legalize all drugs in America, it would eventually restore power to the government, or have they just become too powerful altogether?
The cartels?
Yeah.
Well, the cartels are powerful because of the profits that they make. So the goal is to take away the profits.
Okay.
Yeah.
Agreed. About Nader, and I'm assuming you're kind of pseudo-endorsing them because you're interviewing him and putting it out, but how do you feel about his whole, the system, the 1% mobilizing and all that? Or like if 1% of people active in every congressional district,
I see.
He says, like, do you feel like, how much would that cost? Is that doable? Is that just like, yes, that plus other things?
I'm a little darker. I'm a little more perhaps critical of the functioning system than Ralph.
Right.
This whole theory of reaching out to billionaires to fund populist movements, which he promotes. I love Ralph, by the way. I admire him immensely. I don't know that I asked him, I said, can you give me a moment in human history when the elites ever funded popular movements to bring about their own downfall? So
there's a couple of people doing it now, right? Well, you could argue the American Revolution.
Well, no, the American Revolution replaced a British aristocracy with a native aristocracy.
Well, I know, but
George Washington knew that if he got rid of the British, he would, as he did, become the richest man in America, and he did become the richest man in America. So there was a heavy self-interest. I mean, let's never forget that
we got rid of our taxes on tea.
Yeah, we did, and then we taxed all the poor farmers, and they all lost their farms and started Shays' Rebellion. I mean.
But we should be respectful because they might like rise up like zombies and be like, I didn't die for nothing.
I mean, it was Washington that purged, because at the beginning the Continental Army had significant numbers of African Americans. It was Washington who threw them all out. So, I mean, yeah, I know that's what Ralph argues. I just don't.
Were there any good founding fathers?
Thomas Paine, but he wasn't really a founding father. I mean, and after the Revolution they turned on. No, the greatest figure of the Revolution was Thomas Paine.
Yeah.
Hands down. And, he was, the only reason he rose to prominence is because he was from Philadelphia, and all of the American...
Actually, he was British, right?
He was British. He didn't come to Philly, you're right, till he was 37, but he lived in Philly. And all of the native aristocracy in Philly supported the British. And so they had to reluctantly kind of turn to Paine.
Right.
But after the Revolution, they turned him into a non-person, and Washington was at the head of this.
Right.
Because he was a radical. He was an abolitionist. He was, the term perhaps wasn't invented, he was a socialist. He was an amazing figure.
John Adams?
He didn't reach Paine's level.
Well, no, but fourth favorite president, maybe? Anyway.
I don't know. Why do I like presidents? I don't like presidents. I don't like
know,
anyone in power. Basically, if they're in power, it's...
I'm just trying to bring it into like high school curriculum somehow so that people can like latch on.
I tell my children the greatest day in American history was the day Custer was wiped out of the Little Bighorn. It's the only day I really want to celebrate.
Oh, Crazy Horse is one of my favorites.
Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull.
Yeah.
Amazing figures, and I made my pilgrimage to Wounded Knee and everything else, and yeah.
Awesome.
Now this is a few clips and a montage later of, in my opinion, the two greatest presidents in American history, and that is Franklin Roosevelt and the other one, John F. Kennedy. I do believe these are the most progressive presidents the United States have ever had. So here's a clip of Franklin Roosevelt talking about the Bill of Rights, and a guy who wrote a book about it, analyzing it, which I found fascinating, and I think shows the real Franklin Roosevelt. Like, it shows, and any progressive perspective, analyzing FDR's second Bill of Rights, analyzing in a constitutional aspect, but it shows who the real FDR was, and how FDR was very progressive and was, I think, America's greatest president ever. And the other one is John F. Kennedy, who I think is also, in my opinion, America's most progressive president the United States of America have ever had in its lifetime. So, and I think these two are the most progressive presidents America has ever had. But I do think this is a great clips of analyzing, good informative clips, I'll say. But also, but one of the John F. Kennedy one, this is a good montage of who the real John F. Kennedy is. And this is a really good and amazing clip of showing who the real John F. Kennedy is, and what he stood for, what he fought for, and who he really was, and what were her principal beliefs were. So I encourage you to watch this. I do recommend this clip. So this is a good example of it. So let's watch this and enjoy.
In our day, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
Now Cass R. Sunstein, professor of jurisprudence at the University of Chicago Law School and author of basic books The Second Bill of Rights, FDR's Unfinished Revolution, and Why We Need It More Than Ever, demonstrates that all the more. Now, of course, it was in his dramatic January 11th, 1944 State of the Union message that Franklin Delano Roosevelt set forth what he called America's Second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. He had earlier told Americans that war with the Axis powers required that Dr. Win the War supplant Dr. New Deal for the duration. But now victory was closer, and it was time to look again to the nation's long future with what FDR called the clear realization that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. In our day, continued President Roosevelt, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. And I want to ask my guest today if these days he thinks that is quite so true.
Less true than in Roosevelt's time. Under the assault of some conservative thinkers and under some of the political pressures of the 1980s, many Americans have embraced an anti-government theology, I would say, which fortunately doesn't fit our practices, but which makes it hard to think that the right to education, the right to a chance at a good job, the right to a home, the right to eat, that these things are a part of human rights.
But in a sense, in this wonderful book of yours, you say, stop me if I'm wrong, that that is almost a European concept, not an American concept.
Yeah, Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights has turned out to be lost in the United States. So very few Americans even know about this extremely important part of our history. But the Second Bill of Rights has turned out to be one of the best American exports. So in Europe and even in Iraq now, the constitutional understandings often include a right to a decent chance at economic well-being and the right to education and the right to basic opportunity. So European constitutional thinking really is inspired by Roosevelt. That's our export, but we've lost it at home.
You say lost it at home. Yet if you were to look at the years right before Roosevelt, you would say that it wasn't really part of more than the protest movements in this country. Wouldn't that be true?
In the years before Roosevelt?
Right.
I think Roosevelt's presidency had an arc, and an arc which is in its way even more important and more dramatic than Lincoln's presidency's arc and then George Washington's. Those are our three great presidents. And what Roosevelt started, even in his campaign in 1932, to do was to say people have a right to work and a right to live. And he organized those two central rights, the right to work and the right to live, under the idea of security. And so before Roosevelt's great Second Bill of Rights speech, he himself had been speaking in these terms for well over a decade, and it was very much within American culture to think of these things in terms of rights. He made it more concrete and vivid and dramatic with the Second Bill of Rights proposal, but it didn't come as a bolt from the blue.
Now, you distinguish between the first Bill of Rights, obviously, and the second, and you give, well, not second-class citizenship to the Second Bill of Rights, but you look at it differently.
Yeah, well, Roosevelt didn't want to change the text of the Constitution. So he didn't want to add the right to a good education or the right to a home or the right to Social Security in the text of the Constitution. In that sense, he was a conservative, and he liked to say, I am that kind of conservative because I am that kind of liberal. And what that means is a liberal who respects our constitutional tradition and our text and doesn't tinker with it a whole lot. What Roosevelt wanted to do was not to put the second bill in the Constitution, but to follow the model of his hero Thomas Jefferson, who was responsible for the Declaration of Independence, a declaration which isn't part of our legally binding texts, but which helps animate our self-understanding of the Declaration of Independence in many newspapers every July 4th. What Roosevelt wanted to do was say the Second Bill of Rights, including education, a chance at a job, a right to be free from domination by monopolies, a right to a home, a right to Social Security, that's a kind of promise or commitment that helps define who we are as a people, just like the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't mean that it has lower status than the original Bill of Rights, but it means it's not fundamentally for judges and the Supreme Court, it's fundamentally for the public, something the public can point to and hold its representatives to account.
And it has to do with your saying, in a sense, you don't think that what Roosevelt spoke of as being included in the second bill, the economic rights, should be in the Constitution.
Yeah, well, I'm following Roosevelt here, not following Europe or Iraq. And reasonable people can differ. The Iraq Constitution, Article 13 of the interim Iraq Constitution, supported by the United States, borrows directly from Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights. It says every citizen of Iraq has the right, and it's the word right, to education, security, health care, and more. It grows directly out of Roosevelt. So it's a possible call that would say that modern constitutions should come to recognize that necessitous men are not free men, as Roosevelt said, and should protect opportunity and security in the interest of individualism, which is what Roosevelt thought.
Making them constitutional rights.
Giving them constitutional status, putting them in the text of the document. And the vast majority of modern constitutions actually embody Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, which is why we have an American export here that Americans don't know about. It's as if there was some fantastic product like sneakers or ties that were being worn by everyone in Europe, and they were really good and working well, and Americans didn't even know about them. So that's a reasonable call. With respect to constitutional change, I think Roosevelt was a kind of conservative. That is, he didn't like changing the text of the document. And that was partly because he thought it's a flexible document, it allows the people to govern themselves, it isn't rigidly hidebound, and it's partly because he trusted democracy, and he thought that to put things in the Constitution would limit democracy. So his view of the Second Bill of Rights, which I share, is that what we should think of this as is very much like Jefferson's Declaration. Part of what we're committed to, part of what defines our self-understandings, but we're going to keep the judges out of it. Now, a reasonable other view is that the second bill should be included either in state constitutions or in national constitutions. And there are some state constitutions in the United States that do include the Second Bill of Rights. And there's debate now. You mentioned recovery of the New Deal. There's debate now in various states of the Union, just starting, about putting in the state constitution some of the things that Roosevelt spoke for. If we are excited about judicial protection of individual rights, then we might want the Second Bill of Rights in our Constitution. I myself am nervous about that because I'm nervous about the judges. I'd much prefer that we recover this aspect of our history, that we understand that this is what we've been about, rather than the post-Reagan blunder of thinking America is opposed to government intervention, which is a ridiculous and false characterization of our history.
Freedom from monopoly. You return to that theme again and again in the book, and you particularly emphasize the communications industry.
Yes.
Why so?
Well, a system of free expression requires that there be lots of communications outlets. And if you have something like a monopoly in communications, as every tyrant knows, you can just, by virtue of doing that, prevent freedom of expression from occurring. So freedom requires, I think, a lot of competition. And on this point, Ronald Reagan was right. In the domain of communication, it's not just about freedom in particular, it's about democracy more generally. If you have anything like a monopoly or near monopoly in the world of communication, then the system of free expression can't work.
Well, do we or don't we?
I think it's a mixed bag, and it's what's, let me say the good side and then the bad side. The good side is with the proliferation of channels because of cable and other forms of television, and because of the internet, the number of voices that you can have access to if you have a computer and a TV that gives you a lot of channels, the number of options you get is fantastic. So that's the good side. You can get every point of view under the sun available.
You think numbers count?
Well, it matters.
Rather than diversity, or that numbers are automatically to be equated with diversity?
No, I'm with you on that. That's why I think it's a mixed bag. The other side is that, Bruce Springsteen had a song, 57 channels and nothing on, and that's a dated song because you can have a lot more than 57 channels, but partly because of ownership practices. We often have less diversity in terms of what people are actually seeing and hearing than would be good for a system of free expression.
Billy Mills said, "There's no doubt in my mind that he was shot because of the positions he has taken."
Peace. 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 Some say that it is useless to speak of peace. Peace, 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 peace. Too many think it is unreal. Peace. Too many of us think it is impossible. Peace.
Peace.
Peace and freedom. Peace and freedom. Freedom and peace. Peace and freedom.
Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom.
Genuine peace, genuine peace. In a just and genuine peace. Means of assuring peace. World peace. World peace like community peace. A world of peace. Pursuing the paths of peace. The strategy of peace. For peace is a process. There is no single simple key to this peace. Universal peace and goodwill. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men.
Bringing peace to them.
A peaceful revolution for human rights. For too long, my country, the wealthiest nation in a continent which is not wealthy, failed to carry out its full responsibilities to its sister republics. We have now accepted that responsibility. In the same way, those who possess wealth and power in poor nations must accept their own responsibilities. They must lead the fight for those basic reforms which alone can preserve the fabric of their societies. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Here at home, the future is equally revolutionary. The New Deal and the Fair Deal were bold measures for their generation. But now this is a new generation.
This administration has failed to recognize that in these changing times, with a revolution of rising expectations sweeping the globe, the United States has lost its image as a new, strong, vital, revolutionary society.
The long view shows us that the revolution of national independence is a fundamental fact of our era. This revolution will not be stopped.
I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source. Where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials. Where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference.
We need a permanent unemployment insurance program so that there are those who want to work and can't find a job will not be shifted and living on a marginal income without hope for themselves. These are things which other countries in Western Europe did 30 or 40 years ago. Great Britain, and we regard ourselves as a progressive society, had these provisions at the time of the First World War. And yet this is suggested as a most radical proposal. We have to, in the next 8 years, build as many school buildings as we built in our entire history. And yet, we have found it extremely difficult to secure support for this vital program. We cannot leave the 17 million people who have retired and who may become ill. If they have no money, under the legislation now on the books, they have a chance to receive some as indigents. But that is not the way we believe it should be done. And if their son happens to have some money in the bank, they do not qualify. And he goes and pays out, and it may break him at a time when he has responsibilities to his children. Why it is so difficult to secure passage of a minimum wage, paying somebody in interstate commerce $1 or $1.10 or 15 cents, I do not understand. But it is regarded in some circles as highly radical and highly inflationary. For the first time, unemployed men can retire at 62. For the first time. And I do not regard this as a particularly radical proposal. Dependent children can receive aid for the first time in our history without the wage earner deserting his family. In the old days, before this act was passed, if a child was undernourished, it was necessary for the wage earner to desert his wife and family in order that those children should qualify for assistance. But last year that was changed.
The president's willingness to abandon tradition was responsible, in part, for his failure to succeed with the business community, in spite of efforts at conciliation.
I don't remember the figures exactly, but the president was not extremely popular in Texas, nor was he in the country.
I am delighted to have a chance to say a few words about this administration's policy, which has been the subject of a good deal of discussion, acrimony, and controversy on wages and prices and profits. Now, I know there are some people who say that this isn't any business of the President of the United States, and and who believe that the President of the United States should be the honorary chairman of a great fraternal organization and confine himself to ceremonial functions. But that isn't what the Constitution says. And I did not run for President of the United States to fulfill that office in that way. Harry Truman once said there are 14 or 15 million Americans who have the resources to have representatives in Washington to protect their interests. And that the interests of the great mass of the other people, the 150 or 60 million, is the responsibility of the President of the United States, and I propose to fulfill it. Then I believe it is the business of the President of the United States to concern himself with the general welfare and the public interest, and if the people feel that it is not, then they should secure the services of a new President of the United States.
He was not all that popular in the country, and his popularity had diminished considerably, as a matter of fact.
Businessmen are welcome at the White House, and I welcome the chance to address business meetings such as this. Not because I expect that it will necessarily affect the results of elections, but I do think it can affect what this country does.
He was characterized as being anti-business, and part of that was, I think, the result of his actions with respect to steel prices.
The simultaneous and identical actions of United States Steel and other leading steel corporations increasing steel prices by some $6 a ton constitute a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. In this serious hour in our nation's history, when we are confronted with grave crises in Berlin and Southeast Asia, when we are devoting our energies to economic recovery and stability, when we are asking reservists to leave their homes and families for months on end, and servicemen to risk their lives, and 4 were killed in the last 2 days in Vietnam, and asking union members to hold down their wage requests, at a time when restraint and sacrifice are being asked of every citizen, the American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation in which a tiny handful of steel executives, whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility, can show such utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. A few gigantic corporations have decided to increase prices in ruthless disregard of their public responsibilities. Some time ago, I asked each American to consider what he would do for his country. And I asked the steel companies. In the last 24 hours, we had their answer. I realize that there are some businessmen who feel only they want to be left alone, that government and politics are none of their affairs, that the balance sheet and profit rate of their own corporation are of more importance than the worldwide balance of power or the nationwide rate of unemployment. But I hope it's not rushing the season to recall to you the passage from Dickens' Christmas Carol, in which Ebenezer Scrooge is terrified by the ghost of his former partner, Jacob Marley. And Scrooge, appalled by Marley's story of ceaseless wandering, cries out, "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob." And the ghost of Marley, his legs bound by a chain of ledger books and cash boxes, replied, "Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Members and guests of the Florida State Chamber of Commerce, whether we work in the White House or the State House or in a house of industry or commerce, mankind is our business. And if we work in harmony, if we understand the problems of each other and the responsibilities that each of us bears, then surely the business of mankind will prosper. And your children and mine will move ahead in a secure world, and one in which there's opportunity for them all. Thank you.
No one was more hostile than the Southerners of the far right. Not only were the Kennedys showing themselves soft on communism and in favor of civil rights for black citizens throughout the South, but Kennedy had hurt their pockets by scaling back oil depletion tax credits.
But Texas was home to Kennedy's most dangerous opponents.
Oil millionaires and billionaires in Texas were petrified of one major factor that John F. Kennedy was considering, cutting the oil depletion allowance. And there was no way they were going to allow that. Essentially, they would save billions of dollars if it stays as it is. It was called a 27.5% oil depletion allowance. John Kennedy thought it was too liberal.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
Big business is using the stock market slump as a means of forcing you to come to terms with business. Their attitude is, now we have you where they want you. Have you seen any reflection of this attitude?
I can't believe I'm where big business wants me.
We are anxious to live in harmony with the Russian people.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
A warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. The hard reality of life in much of Latin America will not be solved simply by complaining about Castro, by blaming all problems on communism, or generals, or nationalism.
The Republican National Chairman has said that your administration's attitude in general is one of appeasement toward communism throughout the world. Do you have any comment on this criticism by top spokesman of the opposition party?
No, I don't. Still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique, among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace. That both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity.
It is therefore our intention to challenge the Soviet Union not to an arms race, but to a peace race. Let us call a truce to terror. The logical place to begin is a treaty assuring the end of nuclear tests of all kinds in every environment under workable controls. We also proposed a mutual ban on atmospheric testing without inspection or controls in order to save the human race from the poison of radioactive fallout. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
So in the final part of this video documentary, I'll show you this great video montage of how the CIA can hypnotize people and how the CIA can basically mind control people. And later, how the CIA can overthrow governments and how the CIA basically is just an evil bureaucrat that's just fascist as hell. And then later, in the montage, I'll show you just how corrupt and fascist America has always been. I'll expose to you the corruption of capitalism and why capitalism is just evil and terrible. And why capitalism is just evil. And then finally, here in this documentary, it'll show you that how corrupt and fascist America has always been. And I'll show you why America can never redeem itself and why America was always a fascist state. So behold the truth. So here's the final part to this video, and it's quite interesting. So here's the truth. So here's the final analysis. And in the final part of this documentary, I'll show you just everything. Here's what I'm talking about, and here's a good example of it. And so here it is, and enjoy.
With a past that littered with so many shattered lives and a trail of mental torture, the challenge of the new millennium will be learning how to best protect ourselves from mind control.
Somehow, the average citizen thinks that his or her mind could never be manipulated, and yet every day we're manipulated by each other, we're manipulated by advertising. 1,000 things impact and manipulate us in different ways.
We're bombarded with messages from the media, the radio, the television, and from newspapers that shape our perceptions of the world.
This relentless yet subtle conditioning can develop without you even knowing it.
Watching television is a trance-like experience. You forget about the carpet, the curtains, and that you're sitting in a room, and you engage your experience directly into the television screen, so that whatever happens on the screen seems really real. You know, you suspend belief in reality. If you don't take responsibility for what goes into your mind, somebody else will. Cult leaders, politicians, advertisers will all seek to implant their message in your mind, whether it's for your good or not.
The greatest battle of the 21st century will be a battle of the mind. And there are people who have power who want more power, and they do not want the public to know about mind control, its existence, or how it's implemented.
There is a body of information being used by government to control the way people think and act, and experiments are systematically designed to increase government's knowledge about that. This is the most threatening part of being a citizen in a democracy. When your government can manipulate how you vote and how you think, you no longer live in a democracy.
Well, you know that it's going to be alright. I think it's gonna be alright. Everything will always be alright when we go shopping.
What advertising has always wanted to do is not simply to suffuse the atmosphere, but to become the atmosphere. It wants us not to be able to find a way outside of the world that it creates for us.
It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
That goes straight back in American history. You read the working class press in the mid-19th century, press published by artisans and what were called factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills in eastern Massachusetts, which was the center of beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Their press was calling for, they said their theme was that those who work in the mills ought to own them. Wage labor, which was called wage slavery, was regarded by most Americans as not very different from slavery. Even the Republican Party regarded wage labor as just at best a preliminary to free labor, but intolerable because it's a kind of servitude. A large part of the northern population fighting the Civil War was fighting under that banner.
Last fall, while some people went shopping for new sweaters, the people of Peterborough went shopping for a new energy company.
Deregulation is giving the people the ability to choose.
I think that the town made a really good choice.
With Enron, we've seen energy rates cut between 15 and 18%.
You don't even know that there's a difference until you get your bill.
Nobody likes a monopoly, particularly in a place where the state motto is live free or die.
You can choose your neighbors, and soon you may choose your energy company. Enron.
I know I need to listen.
No one has imported the techniques and philosophy of market research into politics more successfully than Frank Luntz. His clients have been some of the most prominent Republican politicians of the last decade. There was the mayoral campaign for Rudolph Giuliani in 1993, his work for Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, and especially his collaboration with Newt Gingrich on the famous Contract with America, the document that ushered in the Republican Revolution in Congress.
If an electricity company stood up and said, we want to do it for your benefit, we want to do it for our benefit, we want to do it for everyone's benefit, and so we have a better approach.
Tonight, Luntz's client is not a candidate, but a Florida utility wanting to build public support for a change in how it's regulated on the environment.
I know that the public is very down on corporate America in general, and they're down on power companies. So what is the language? What is the information? What are the facts? What are the figures that would get Americans to say, you know what, my electricity company, it's okay?
On one hand, you have wind, which has no fossil fuels associated with it.
To get at his subjects' gut feelings, Luntz has them register their moment-by-moment responses to a speech by a power company executive.
Climbing, changing fuels.
But watching Luntz work, I couldn't help wondering, do the words he's found help the public see the issue more clearly, or do they disguise it? Is Luntz listening to us so his clients can give us what we want, or so we can figure out how to make us want what they have to sell?
The words work. The words apply to the policy. This is how we're going to sell it. And I will be able to walk to this electricity company on Monday and be able to say to them, your policy makes sense, and here's the language to explain it. That was the eureka moment. When I watched people nod their heads, I watched them look to each other, and they were willing at this point to fight for this position. You're replacing the bad with the good. It's almost like in with
This is a guy who is merchandising ideas and merchandising a movement and merchandising a political party. And in many instances, the words that he says are the ones that resonate, are ones that obscure to some extent the issue.
Take the so-called death tax. When it was called the estate tax, most people supported it. But Luntz managed to turn public opinion against it simply by giving it an emotionally loaded new name.
For years, political people and lawyers, who, by the way, are the worst communicators, used the phrase estate tax. And for years, they couldn't eliminate it, but the public wouldn't support it because the word estate sounds wealthy. Someone like me comes around and realizes that it's not an estate tax, it's a death tax, because you're taxed at death. And suddenly, something that isn't viable achieves the support of 75% of the American people. It's the same tax, but nobody really knows what an estate is. But they certainly know what it means to be taxed when you die. I'd argue that is a clarification. That's not an obfuscation.
Luntz has admonished Republican politicians to talk about tax relief instead of tax cuts, and to replace the war in Iraq with the war on terror. He once told his party to speak of climate change, not global warming.
What is the difference? It is climate change. Some people call it global warming, some people call it climate change. What is the difference?
It apparently made enough difference to Republicans that they began to use climate change almost exclusively.
Cause climate change.
The President's Global Climate Change Initiative.
Climate change research.
And we must address the issue of global climate change.
You should look at public opinion polls for the same reason that they are taken. Why do we have so many public opinion polls in the United States? They're mostly business initiated. The propaganda institutions, like the PR industry, they want to keep their finger on the public pulse. They got to know how to design the propaganda. So they want to know what people are thinking. So in fact, if you want to find out, you can find out too. And you can find out how these opinions are changed.
The most effective kind of propaganda was defined as the kind where the subject moves in the direction you desire for reasons which he believes to be his own.
What really matters is the fact that the major institutions in the society are under totalitarian control. After all, what's a corporation? You know, a corporation is just a tyrannical system, one of the most tyrannical systems that humans have ever devised. They've been given extraordinary rights by the courts, not by legislation, early in this century. They're, like the multilateral agreement would give them actually the rights of states. They're basically unaccountable to the public. When they've been given the rights of persons, that means, for example, they have the right to propagandize. So like they've been given the rights of free speech, which is insane. You know, these are collectivist institutions. They've been given the right to advertise, in fact, at your expense. So you get the tax-free, so you pay for the privilege of having your minds destroyed. They own the information system. I mean, they control the information system. What are the media? You know, huge corporations, parts of bigger corporations. That sets the framework of discussion. The major decisions that affect what happens in the economy and social life are made behind closed doors. Very little public accountability. They have the right of freedom from search and seizure. You know, Fourth Amendment rights means you can't know anything about what they're doing. You know, And they have enormous power. Furthermore, I mean, it's described as free trade. It's ridiculous. I mean, these are secret institutions, so all figures have to be taken with a big grain of salt because nobody really knows. But the guesses are that by international economists that maybe 40% or so of U.S. trade is actually internal to corporations, meaning it's not trade at all. You know, it's just moving something across a border. It's no more trade than moving from Indiana to Illinois or something like that. Happens across a border, you know, to get cheaper labor, to avoid environmental restrictions and so on. Well, you know, 40% is not a small number. And that's a vast underestimate because there are also complicated strategic alliances among alleged competitors. So IBM and Toshiba and Siemens and so on are working together. You know, they're working together on design, on marketing, and so on. And in fact, it's gotten to the point where some international economists call it a new system of what they call alliance capitalism. You know, big networks of tyrannical institutions basically running the world. I mean, in comparison with this, the difference between, you know, everybody voting and everybody not voting is pretty trivial.
In the Reagan administration, you really had a massive enterprise to control the public mind. In fact, when this was exposed during the Iran-Contra hearings, partially exposed, one high administration official described it as the most successful operation they carried out. He said it's the kind of operation that you carry out in enemy territory. And that expresses the attitude toward the population completely. The population is the enemy, and you've got to control enemy territory, and the way you do it is by very extensive public diplomacy, meaning propaganda.
Intelligent propaganda is not a propaganda that tells blatant lies. It's something where you try to show the good side of what you're supporting, and you don't tell about the negatives. You only tell about the positives, which is true, but it's only a half-truth. And then it makes it a half-lie, if you will.
It is told in the words and from the perspective of the power wielders, and with no view from outside the walls. And that's really, I think, in a nutshell, the problem with so much of the coverage in Washington, is that the habits of mind that inform it, the sympathies that inform it, are all with the people at the top, and not with the people outside the palace.
The biggest joke, I think, in Washington is the idea that the press has an adversarial relationship to the city it covers and to the class of politicians and bureaucrats that it covers, when in fact it is so far from their adversary, it's a component of their life. It's a vicarious member of the same club. The adversarial definition is part of the self-flattery, the self-adoration with which the press conceives of its role and justifies its role to the public, who, of course, would like to think that there was a watchdog instead of a lapdog in Washington. They aren't so lucky.
Inside the club, it's getting hard to tell anymore who's the reporter and who's the politician. These days, they sometimes just spin together in Washington's revolving door.
I used to worry about blurred lines. Now the lines, they're not even blurred, they're gone. The lines are gone. I mean, people pop in and out of administrations all the time. Jim Fallow, speechwriter for Jimmy Carter, then national correspondent for The Atlantic. I mean, it just, I didn't like it at first, but it's a phenomenon of our time, of the 80s and 90s, that people are going to work in politics and go into journalism, and they're going to pop back and forth.
No, I don't think Bob Dole's a mean person. I think he's an undisciplined person. And
the most notorious case of media cross-dressing involved ABC commentator George Will.
George Will helped to prep Ronald Reagan for a presidential debate with papers that had been stolen in a black propaganda operation from Jimmy Carter's campaign. Having helped in that obscene prep, he then went on the air as an objective commentator later that night to say that he thought Reagan, viewing it objectively, dispassionately, fair-mindedly, even-handedly, and so on, had done best in the debate, rating the horse that he'd been secretly training. Paid no price for it.
More than anyone, political analyst David Gergen seems stuck in the revolving door.
Bob, you decided to call this book The Choice that voters must make this November.
After working for Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, Gergen began writing for U.S. News and World Report and appearing on McNeil Lehrer. Then he returned to politics as a Clinton advisor, and now he's back in the media.
When you click on that set, you sort of have to say, what to yourself? Am I seeing David Gergen, the thoughtful journalist, as he sometimes is, or am I seeing a guy who fairly recently was in the employ of Bill Clinton as a paid propagandist? Sometimes even I find the lines too blurry to follow the action.
Through propaganda, we can derogate our opponents and dehumanize them. You know, we didn't refer to Germans, we referred to Huns. We didn't refer to Italians, we referred to, as you know, we didn't refer to Vietnamese, we referred to Gooks. So Huns and Wops and Gooks and Japs were the short circuit that we would take to dehumanize our adversaries and to reduce them to a sub level.
The time, the middle of the 19th century. The place, the American West. The Armed Forces Screen Magazine presents the covered wagon, backbone of the Western Trek, didn't stand a chance when it was traveling alone through hostile country. When attack came, the covered wagon could protect itself only if it banded together with other wagons. This was mutual defense. This was mutual security. We as a nation are able to live a peaceful life, but hanging over us all is the specter of a haunting and horrible fear.
The medium weight force is clearly the force of the future. It's a cavalry type force, and clearly the Indians are out there. That's politically incorrect, but we're dealing with cavalry and Indians again, and the cavalry is what we need.
In order to stop saboteurs armed with atomic explosives, we could search all planes and trains and boats and automobiles crossing our borders from now on. We could open every single package. We could remain on a constant 24-hour, day in, day out alert.
Man muss nämlich gut regieren und für eine gute Regierung auch eine gute Propaganda betreiben. Das eine gehört zum anderen. Eine gute Regierung ohne Propaganda kann ebenso wenig bestehen wie eine gute Propaganda ohne eine gute Regierung.
I was raised in a milieu where I was taught that communism leads to dictatorship and that capitalism leads to democracy. But it's not that simple.
The essence of a politician, of the political animal, is the pursuit of power.
You can say what you want about this country, and I love this place. I love the freedoms we used to have. I love it. I love that.
So what do they get when they are elected to office? They get power, not money, power.
Free market capitalism definitely democratizes a country and a culture. But corporate crony capitalism, of the kind we're seeing with this White House, is as antithetical to democracy in America as it is in Nigeria.
Power of concentrated wealth shall not be abused.
Americans have to understand the difference between free market capitalism, which benefits our country, and this kind of corporate crony capitalism where we have large corporations running our government, and there's a name for that, and the name is fascism.
And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob.
A need to dominate, a need to control, and again, above all, a need to dominate.
The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything.
Big Brother is watching you and the little people.
Obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money.
It's not a conspiracy.
And what he found was no criminal conspiracy.
It can't really be a conspiracy.
There's no conspiracy?
No conspiracy.
Everyone is saying the exact same thing on the exact same day. It's almost as if there was some kind of, I don't know. What's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of larger plan.
A need to control, a need to dominate, which is what leads people into politics.
The temptation to use public power and play God is almost irresistible.
I am Oz, the great and powerful.
As of now, I am in control here.
To the corrupt, thieving politicians of America.
We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret.
And Franklin Roosevelt said that. He said fascism is the control of government by large corporations for their own benefit. And I close with this. I have an American Heritage Dictionary, the last edition, which I keep at home, which says it defines fascism as the control of government by large corporations with right-wing ideology driven by bellicose nationalism. If that sounds familiar to a lot of you.
Decisions are made on bases other than what is best for the country and what is best for the ordinary people in this country. They have other motives, other drives, other wants, other needs, and they exercise them.
I'm reminded of de Tocqueville's remarks is when tyranny comes to the United States, he said it will be very, very quiet, and it'll be the sleep that comes over the somnolence that comes over quiet and pacific industrial animals, comparing us to sheep out in the meadow.
I was sure that ours was a nation of the ballot, not the bullet, until the murders of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. We were taught that our armies were always invincible and our causes were always just.
Jesus, Gandhi, Lincoln, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, John Lennon, they all said, try to live together peacefully. Bam!
While survival of the fittest may be a good working description of the process of evolution, a government of humans should elevate itself to a higher order.
We apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. By the way, it's the same big club they used to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged, and nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care.
The note is that we have dumbed the public down to the point where I think most people don't realize what they're missing. They don't know what's out there.
The great Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth, and it is a warning.
So that was my final analysis of this video documentary I made. And I hope you enjoyed my documentary. I hope it's informative and you get something out of it. I hope you learn something from it. I hope you get informed from it. But the point is, I hope you enjoy the truth about Marxism and the good aspects of socialism. My two favorite progressive presidents and why they're so good, and why they have to be the best progressive presidents ever in this country. And the CIA, the truth about the CIA and the government, and I expose the shadow government here. And fascism, corruption, you name it. This video was just about why America is just really fascist and corrupt, and why I believe that America has always been a fascist state that can never recover from this. So that's my thoughts on that. So that's all I gotta say, and I hope you guys have a good one. So take care. And so guys, I'm Comrade Darkslayer, over and out, and peace out and bye.